Welcome, everybody. My name is Lee Paddock. I'm the Associate Dean for the Environment and Energy Program here at George Washington University Law School. And we're happy to be partnering with the Sustainability Collaborative here at GW and with C2ES on this project. A couple of brief logistics. So women's restroom out this side and just outside of the door. There's an all-gender restroom on this side, and if you're interested in a men's restroom, down the hall towards the far end of the hallway. We've been engaged for probably about the last 8 years, really focusing on energy issues at the law school. We started our Journal of Energy and Environmental Law. It's in its 8th edition now. Donna Atanasio joined us about 4 years ago to start up our Sustainable Energy Initiative. We're now teaching 8 or 9 classes in energy law, so you can see energy is a really important part of our curriculum and an issue that students are very interested in. We have a number of international students who come here just because they want to do energy law. So this is really an important area for the law school and an important area for the country as a whole, and we're glad to be able to work in this area. We're part of GW's Sustainability Collaborative. I serve as the law school's representative on the collaborative. The purpose of the collaborative is to work across schools on important sustainability issues. And so we work with many of the university schools in that regard. We're also happy to be partnering with C2ES. It's probably 2 years or more that we've been working in kind of a strategic partnership between C2ES and George Washington. They bring incredibly deep expertise on climate change that we don't have here at the law school, and we're at the same time able to provide access to faculty in many other areas that I think support C2ES's programming. We wanted to, there's a few thank yous that I think are important with respect to GW. The first of those is to Donna for the work she's done on this report, and Josh Robichaud, one of our students, who's also been a big part of this work. We also need to thank the Sustainability Collaborative, and particularly Kathleen Merrigan, who heads that up, and the research director, Bob Ortong, who is over here, who helps coordinate all of the research for the Sustainability Collaborative. We also want to thank Duke Energy Renewables. As some of you may know, half of the energy that powers GW, our hospital, and American University comes from a large solar farm, I think 40 megawatts, in North Carolina that was built by Duke Renewables, and we have a power purchase agreement that allows us to draw half of our energy from that particular facility. I don't know, Dan Fiorino's from American. I don't know whether he knows that half of his energy comes from Duke, but it's all part of that agreement. As a result of that, Duke Energy Renewables established a Renewables Innovation Fund, and that's the fund that's allowed us to do a number of projects, including this one, to support research on emerging areas in renewable energy. And the grant, of course, also supported this conference. So we look very much forward to hearing your reaction to this work and additional opportunities that might come from this work to partner with members of government, industry, and nonprofit organizations on projects that further advance the understanding of the complex and growing sector that's reflected in microgrids. And with that, I'm very happy to turn the floor over to Janet Peace from C2ES, who will introduce the program.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome all of you in the room, those of you online. I'm Janet Peace. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Business Strategy at C2ES. We're very happy to have you here for what I think will be a very interesting discussion with experts who will explore the growing momentum of microgrids. Before we start the program, I have to also thank our partners at GW, Lee, Donna, Dio. We have 3 of the authors. I think we have 3. I don't see Dio, actually. We have 2 of the authors of our report in the room at this point. We have Doug Vine from C2ES, Donna Tanzio from GW, and unfortunately, maybe Dio will show up a little bit later. But anyway, if you're interested in specifics of the paper, maybe you can raise your hands. Folks will know where you are, and they can ask you after the event. I also want to join Lee in thanking the Duke Energy Renewables Innovation Fund at GW for their support. For C2ES, we also need to thank the Energy Foundation and JPB for supporting our work with communities and with innovative solutions for clean energy. If you're not familiar with my organization at C2ES, we're a top-ranked, nonpartisan think tank located across the river. We bring diverse stakeholders together to find practical solutions to our climate and clean energy challenges. Now, more than ever, I think it's really important for cities and states and businesses to take the leadership with respect to clean energy and resilient deployment. We need to really work together to reduce emissions that are contributing to climate change and to prepare for the impacts that we can't avoid at this point. So we wanted to look, somebody actually, before the event, asked me why microgrids? Why did we take a look at this? We see them as playing an important role in creating a resilient and efficient, low-emissions electricity system. So those of you who have been working on this issue for a while may have noticed that the definition of a microgrid has evolved in the last few years. I know when I first started in this space, is to think of a microgrid as a combined heat and power facility that either provided power for an industrial or backup power for an industrial or a military facility. But today's definition, it's really much broader. A microgrid can run on renewables. Or they can run on emerging sources of fuel like fuel cells, and potentially one day maybe small modular nuclear when they're commercially available. They also power more than just industrials and military facilities. They're powering municipal facilities, they're powering urban neighborhoods, and as we were discussing prior to the event, they're also powering some remote communities. And one quote, I guess, if you will, that we heard during our research that I found particularly insightful is that if you've seen one microgrid, you've seen exactly one microgrid. And it's really these unique qualities that are the source of both the opportunities for microgrids and also the challenges. And I think, with the significant interest that we're seeing in microgrids, I think it's easy to see that there are a lot of people who think they're very promising. They can improve reliability, they can help with resilience, they can keep the lights on during extreme weather and disasters when the main grid is affected. They can also help us increase efficiency. They can better manage electricity supply and demand, and potentially bring on and help better integrate renewables. So in short, we see them as creating opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. So that's why microgrids. But again, the unique combination of power sources, customers, geographies, markets, they can all be pretty confusing when you start talking to investors. Add to that the legal frameworks that are confusing. A lot of states lack even the legal definition of what's a microgrid, and regulatory and legal challenges can make it challenging between states, but also within a state. So our report, the report that we're releasing today, if you didn't pick up a copy, there's one out there in the front for you. Our report tries to identify some of these challenges and suggest some of the solutions for these challenges. And in our sessions today, we're going to be looking at some of those solutions, for example, public-private partnerships. Hopefully, those can help overcome some of the financial barriers. And then state policies. For example, we've got some states that have created green banks, resilient banks. They've created grants and other funding opportunities. New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut. I don't think I've missed any at that point, but there's many types of opportunities to help fund microgrids. And also in our paper, we lay out a linear program that can help focus the discussion on cost savings, emission reductions, and the pros and cons of independence from the main grid. So we have two really excellent panels lined up. We've invited to speak to you today. And at this point, maybe I can invite our first panel to come and sit at the table. You know, we've got everybody's bios out in the front, so I don't want to just read to you the bios. I would think that's kind of boring. I mean, we could probably go on a full half an hour with all the accomplishments of our panelists. So, but I do want to give you a little bit of a highlight so you know where the perspective of our panelists are coming from. I'll just start right here. Sudipta Lahiri is a senior consultant and energy advisor at DNV LGL. He specializes in technical, regulatory, and commercial aspects of microgrids, energy storage, and advanced behind-the-meter applications. Dr. Lahiri has helped utilities, project developers with planning, assessment, and evaluation of more than 30 distributed storage and microgrid projects. We also have Jill, did I say that right?
Close enough, yes.
Okay, from AECOM. Joel is part of the critical infrastructure protection team at AECOM, and he's worked for over 30 years on many aspects of automation and controls, many infrastructure projects, and many microgrid projects in the U.S. and globally. Then, not last but not least, if that's the same, Shalom. He's a microgrid architect with Urban Ingenuity. He's the first microgrid architect, and he manages the technical, financial, and regulatory aspects of microgrid projects, from initial assessment, conceptual design, through financing, permitting, and engineering. I think we'll go ahead and start with Sudipta. Do you want to go ahead and give some opening remarks? And I think we'll just do some opening remarks, and we'll have a conversation, and then I want to make sure we have enough time for questions from the audience. Sudipta?
Thank you, Janet. It's a pleasure to be here today, this morning, talking about something that's really close to my heart. Thank you to C2ES for having me on this panel and being on this panel with such eminent speakers. I have been in the microgrid sphere for around 8 years, initially in R&D, and now working as a technical consultant focusing on commercialization, business development, and development of new opportunities. This market, this concept is still at an incipient stage, so this is a really exciting time to be in this technology and be in this market. I work for a Norwegian company called DNV-GL. We are the largest independent renewables and energy advisory firm in the world. So in the microgrid sphere, so I work in the emerging technology group in our company, trying to develop new businesses and applications. In the microgrid sphere, a lot of the work we do are as engineers or technical consultants, in the sense that we help project developers and utilities through different phases of a microgrid project. Generally, we help folks where they might not have sufficient technical expertise because it's a new technology, or they might not have the bandwidth, resource bandwidth with all the different stages of a project. So we assist starting from the conceptual and planning stage to the pre-development, to permitting and interconnection, to vendor and technology acquisition, construction monitoring, commissioning, and then performance monitoring. Because it's such an early industry, a lot of our work has been in the planning and conceptualization stages. Another core area that we offer, our core expertise, is third-party assessment. Essentially, we are the leading providers of independent reviews, due diligence, and bankability studies. So if a project, in the renewable sphere, in the energy storage sphere, and now trying to expand that business into microgrids, so if a project or if a technology vendor wants to get financing, they would need someone like us to come in and review their technology, review their processes, and so forth. And we create those reports that technology vendors take to financiers, or financiers ask from technology vendors or project developers. Over the past, in my work, I spend, I guess, 50% of my time in microgrids and 50% of my time in batteries. And I'm really excited at the way that the battery industry is progressing, and I think it has like really very exciting implications on the commercialization of microgrids, in the sense that, I feel that some of the aspects of commercialization of storage and solar plus storage is going to, propagate to the microgrid sphere. And at this point, I think one of my main, points would be that we have the technology. The technology is there and has been there to really implement this concept in a safe and reliable way. What the industry is trying to develop and work on are commercial models. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joel.
You were going to go next, right?
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. It's nice to see some familiar faces, but especially nice to see new faces. It's a growing industry, and we need lots of folks getting involved in order to move things along. So 5 minutes is not very much.
You could extend to 6.
Okay. So then what can you do in 5 minutes? Oh, well, that's probably enough for like 2 clickbait articles. So here's your first one. Here are the 3 keys to success for microgrid projects. Okay, key number 1, maximize solar, but don't depend on solar. Okay. Now, I'm mostly talking about an urban context for microgrids. A neighborhood may be like this. The buildings are too big to be able to get much of your power from solar. I'm actually teaching a sustainability class at another local university that starts with a G. And the graduate students, I have been forced to go through these exercises of calculating, well, how much roof area is there and how much can you actually produce? And it turns out that in normal urban areas, we're not talking skyscrapers here, just moderate density, you're lucky if you can get 10% of your energy needs from rooftop solar, even if you plaster every available surface. You're even doing pretty well if you get 5%. So the incentives are there, the finances make sense, the emissions benefits are real, but if you're only covering 5 to 10% of your total energy, you're going to need more than that, and especially from a resiliency perspective, even if you put in huge amounts of unaffordable batteries, solar's not going to be enough. Second key to success is don't forget about thermal. If you're talking most places in the world, and certainly Middle Atlantic or Northeast, 40% of the energy consumption for buildings is heating and hot water and air conditioning. So if you're not addressing the thermal, you're not really going to be able to get the financial savings, you're not going to get the emissions reductions, so don't forget about the thermal. Okay? And your third key to success, go for scale. As Janet said, if you've seen one microgrid, you've seen one microgrid. There are upfront design costs. You need to hire folks like AECOM and DNV. That's expensive. If you're going to pay back those fixed costs, you need to be looking for your M's, multi-megawatts, millions of square feet. Okay, so those are your 3 keys for success. Maximize solar, but don't count on it. Go for thermal, and go for scale. All right, that was clickbait article number 1. Worth clicking on? All right, good. Number 2, there are 5 kinds of microgrids. 3 of them are great, but 2 of them tend to fail. Would you click on that? All right, so I'll do the failures first. You get these backup-only microgrids. Atlantic City Electric proposed one of these. BG&E had 2 of them last year for public purpose microgrids. The design that Sandia originally did for Hoboken. These are things that basically only turn on when the grid goes down. That means you've got idle assets that you paid a fortune for that you almost never use. That doesn't work financially. It also means you're not getting any emissions reductions because most of the time the stuff isn't operating. And you're not really sure it's going to work when it finally does turn on because you're not using it regularly. Not a good recipe. Okay. Second type that tends to fail is what I call the Firehouse Plus Library microgrid. Okay? These are small, so that violates one of the keys to success. The thermal loads tend to suck, so that violates another key to success. You're not getting enough scale to really move the needle on emissions reductions. They're not going to pay for themselves. It comes out of the municipal budget. So you'll get some resiliency benefit, but it'll cost you a fortune, and that's about it. All right, so what are some better recipes? And again, we're talking mostly urban context, not the remote microgrids. That's a different story. So the classic one, as Janet described, is CHP plus solar. You're talking here in a classic district energy approach, a campus setting, a downtown, a hospital district. These are winners. We have a fair number of them that are kind of proto-microgrids, the old CHP systems that are learning now how to interact more with the big grid, provide stability and services, earn more revenues, and I have some of the modern controls and electronics to make all that possible. Princeton University has been very public about their learning process for that, and they've been successful at it. So that's the easiest win. Another one that we're starting to see is one that really follows the advice of don't forget about the thermal, and it's essentially a thermal only. For example, using a condenser water loop across multiple buildings across a site so that you can take advantage of a unique thermal source or sink in order to be highly efficient for serving your heating and cooling loads. Doesn't get you the resiliency benefit, but it pays for itself and does fantastic on the emissions reductions if you look at it. Better than solar. Okay? And then the third one is actually solar. Even though I said you can't count on solar, if you have a situation where you're getting solar saturation, we haven't seen too much of it yet, but we're starting to get there in Hawaii. We're going to see it in lots of places, including here. If every single family home down the block has solar panels, the current grid can't accommodate that. You're not going to be able to do it. The grid operator, the local utility, is going to have to turn you down once you get to a certain saturation level on that feeder, unless you turn that whole feeder into a microgrid itself. And then you can concentrate small amount of storage and some of the smarts and communications, including for the grid interaction and grid services. Now you can get some modest resiliency benefit. These aren't premium power critical infrastructure customers. These are people who want to keep the stuff in their freezer frozen with a few hours of power a day and be able to recharge their cell phones. That you can do. So those are 3 ways to make microgrids succeed, and I look forward to getting into more details in the Q&A.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. My name is Joel Langill. I'm on a very unique team at AECOM. We're a major engineering design firm, and we are responsible for building a lot of critical infrastructure as well as facilities that are very conducive to microgrids in general. So we're active in building entertainment venues, we build sports complexes, we build skyscrapers, plus we build chemical and process plants and things like that. So I come from the trenches. I've spent most of my career developing infrastructure around the world. And a key part of infrastructure is obviously power and the whole power distribution and generation infrastructure. I've also been involved in a lot of oil and gas type infrastructure development and have learned very quickly the importance of security when we start to take a look at how society currently takes a lot of things for granted. Most people take electricity for granted. They expect when they plug something into the wall that it's going to supply them power. But as we've seen over the past couple decades, natural events can have a huge impact on this. So now we get into this discussion, and probably a term that you hear a lot now is this concept of resilience. Now, remember, I'm the cyber guy, so when I look at resilience, I am looking at it more from a true holistic threat perspective, right? So threats can either be man-made or natural. They can be intentional or accidental. So the idea when we start to move and deploy microgrids at a larger scale is understanding the trade-offs that will occur between the current generation, distribution, transmission infrastructure, which we call the macrogrid, and those microgrids. And an important concept that I right now am very active in doing what are called TVRAs, or threat vulnerability and risk assessments. And always what falls out is the ability of an organization, whether it's a military installation or a business, to operate and maintain essential services in different scenarios. Again, whether they're man-made or natural. So the idea in these TVRAs is to be very clear on how we look at a risk-benefit trade-off. Because one thing that we're seeing is that a lot of people will always take the obvious risk of one solution, for instance, a cyber attack against the grid, and immediately transition that to say, well, we can remove that risk by moving from a macro to a microgrid concept. The problem is that what is a risk in one is an opportunity to the other, but the converse occurs just as well. So what was an opportunity to the utilities, the large utilities in a macro grid infrastructure, is now a true risk to the microgrid deployment. And that's where we come in, because what's very important is to not say, okay, fine, if we decouple from the grid, we can have a more resilient solution, and we can decouple ourselves from the likelihood of a cyber attack. Unfortunately, that is not true, because what happens is, when you start to look at this from a true threat-based perspective, you will find that now once you're in a microgrid deployment, it depends on the target's attractiveness to the adversary. So for instance, if you're a defense installation, you are a very attractive target to an adversary. So the problem with microgrids is unless they're deployed using the same rigor, the same design, the same maintenance and support concepts that we currently have with larger installations, you actually could expose yourself to far greater risks than what you thought you had before. So that's why we're going to kind of balance this out between the discussions, because the benefits of microgrids are enormous, and we're all very excited to these concepts. I live in a very rural part of the country. Our electric infrastructure is very, very dependent on the weather. So we've learned to kind of get by in the absence of depending on this 100% of the time. But now when we start to go to dense urban areas, the concept becomes very different. I'm spending a lot of time in New York City now, and of course this is a key aspect there as we start to look at how we're going to provide a more resilient infrastructure through the deployment of microgrids is one aspect. I'll hand it back over.
Well, I think you guys have touched on many of the key attributes, the benefits, why microgrids, what are some of the challenges. Let me ask you, and Joel started down this path of what are the key risks? You know, we've got a lot of moving pieces. How can projects manage these risks and ensure that we have quality outcomes in a microgrid project? We want to take that on?
Sure, yeah. So if you compare microgrids to, say, single resource project deployment, it's way more complex. You have different kinds of generation and storage technologies. You may have different classes of customers. You have different classes of equipment. Your revenue models, you might have multiple revenue streams, unlike a single PPA, a single off-taker PPA, as in, say, a renewable plant or a single resource energy plant. So what we always advise is that, putting sufficient due diligence and thought in the planning and the pre-development stage is critical. Planning the project out in, taking and making sure that you are covering all the potential risks and all the potential paths to follow is really critical. Another thing especially for projects, microgrids, for projects that are looking to secure financing, project financing, a key aspect is to try to get assured revenue streams, is to try to get into long-term contracts with, for example, anchor customers. Now, unlike single resource plans, microgrids can provide multiple services to multiple customers. So you might have, contracts that provide energy to certain customers, contracts that provide reliability, contracts that provide demand reduction. You can be contracted with the grid or the utility to provide over-the-meter services in the sense of capacity services. So it's kind of, but for any project, it's kind of important for the financial viability to try to get into long-term contracts for an assured revenue stream. The main technology risk of microgrid projects is the integration risk. In that sense, if you have legacy equipment that you're trying to integrate, for example, if you have, say, legacy building management systems that you're trying to integrate, you have old CHP plants that you're trying to integrate, that integration part carries the biggest technology risk. In that sense, it's, for the developer or for the project owner, it's a really good idea to try to offtake that risk to, say, to a primary integrator. Apart from that, making sure that the vendors you're getting are properly vetted and qualified, making sure that you have warranties on the different pieces of equipment you're getting, and you have extended warranties that covers the terms of your long-term contract. These are kind of, very basic concepts that kind of reduce the risk in microgrid projects.
So I'd say actually it's the wrong question. It's the one that everybody asks. What are the risks of this project? Really what you need to be asking is, how do the risks of a microgrid compare to the risks of not doing a microgrid? Right? If you don't do a microgrid, you are vulnerable to ongoing price increases from energy suppliers that are outside of your control. You're vulnerable to failures, outages, et cetera, with no recourse to be able to have your business continuity, and so on. So risks can never be viewed in isolation. Now, what are some of the risks that you do want to be able to manage if you decide to go forward with a microgrid project? One is that you don't necessarily want an all-in-one decision. Part of the value of microgrids is that once you have on-site resources, you have flexibility for deployment, for management, for incremental installation. You can put a number on that value if you use a real options analysis. So you don't want to lock yourself in. But another risk is that you're too timid, that you wind up with on-site generation that only covers a little portion or only covers one kind of your energy usage. One of the big advantages of microgrids is the system integration, is being able to trade off electric versus thermal, on-site versus grid interaction, and so forth. So you don't want to be too timid. And there's obviously a lot of risk nowadays for the initial microgrid projects from the regulatory environment, which was not designed with microgrids in mind. I know we have Kyle Haas from DOEE, who has experience with those issues in multiple jurisdictions. I hope we'll hear more from him about that area.
See, I do agree that the risk is not the risk of success, but the risk of not deploying in the first place. But where I'm really starting to spend a lot of time in advising clients is actually how extensive they want to do their deployment. Because the risk that we often see is that people fail to consider a complete, comprehensive, kind of as we started the discussion, making sure you have maintenance and support, ongoing warranties, ongoing equipment, all of the infrastructure that you would need in order to support a facility, you have to make sure you address. Because the risk then becomes, again, we're doing this to improve resilience, we're doing it to improve the availability of our business services to our client base. But in the absence of taking into account all of these potential pitfalls, you could in fact cause a net reduction, not a net increase in those efficiencies, if you fail to address all aspects that what it's going to take as you move away from depending on a utility provider to doing this yourself. And that's why a lot of the formations that we're starting to see are actually not with a small entity trying to deploy a microgrid, but rather kind of a shared community, so that the burden isn't all on one particular enterprise or one particular business, but it can be shared amongst several partners in a community.
You know, we've had, we've heard from Shalom about the advice on developing microgrids, and we're going to open it up our questions here in a moment. but I would really like to hear Sudipta and from Joel, what advice you would give to cities and regions as they think about developing microgrids.
One more point on the risk. I
Okay,
think the one area that your report really covered very nicely is summarizing the legal and regulatory issues around microgrids. In the sense that the regulatory risk is probably number one when you're developing a project, if in the sense that sometimes you might not know how long a permitting process might take, you might not know how long an interconnection process might take or what it might cost. You're not sure whether regulations might changing kind of the effectiveness of the project, during the project life, so things like that. And I think the report summarizes that really well. I have, in terms of advice, some like really small nuggets of practical advice is, especially during the conceptualization and planning stage, is generally, it's not a good idea to overbuild the system. Try to maximize the technology selection and asset sizing is kind of the key, the key decision or the key quantitative decision that, say, you need to make at the beginning of the project. So try to understand what services that you would like to provide, what services that you can monetize, what services is necessary to which clients. So create a stakeholder list, create a customer list. Try to chalk down the services that you can provide or you want or you will provide and the services that you'll get paid for through long-term contracts. And then based on that, select the technologies and size the technologies appropriately. So for example, you don't, like Shalom said, you don't want to be stranded. You don't want to have stranded assets. You don't want to have assets that are not operating to their full, optimal capacity or optimal efficiencies. You want to maximize the resource potential within the microgrids, whether it be, based as in the Northeast, CHP-based microgrids, or as in California and the Southwest, renewable-based microgrids, solar plus storage microgrids. So I think that was one key point. I'll throw it over to Joel.
Yes, see, one piece of advice I would have, and kind of in line with what Shalom was saying, is many people have a lot of these backup systems in place. And the ones that I'm typically encountering are actually quite large. The idea for a lot of these entities as they start to address long-term resilience is really to move these assets from being idle assets that have enormous capital burdens on them to actually operational assets where they're getting a return on their investment. So I kind of wanted to keep it short because I'm watching time.
Joel. Shalom, you had three great pieces of advice. Do you want to add anything to those?
No, I gave my clickbait article.
Okay, all right. So at this point, we could take a few questions from the audience. Does anybody have anything you want to? We've got one here in the back.
I have several questions.
Okay, get one.
One per individual? That's pretty much what I have. For you, sir, you mentioned 5 items, or 5 microgrids that are out there. You didn't mention if it's AC or DC on either one. That'd be nice to know. I'd like to know that. For you, sir, you didn't mention an offset strategy on your financing. What would you back up when you put in something? How do you offset that? How do you risk management, if you want to say it that way, on your financial modeling? For you, sir, you mentioned long-term contracts, but you're not giving us 5, 10, 15 years. Is there another clause within the contract that says you have a technology clause? After so many years, this gets replaced and the contractor actually does it. That would be my 3 questions. Thank you.
Well, I'm actually going to answer your last question. The longer the term of the contract, the better. Most of microgrid infrastructure costs more upfront and pays back over time. The more you can lengthen that time horizon, the more investment will make sense. You don't want to cut it off artificially because then there are things that will make sense, but you can't do it because the time horizon isn't right. Now, you do still want to build in some opportunities for exit if there isn't performance. So there has to be shared incentives to make things work if you're going to make that kind of long-term commitment. AC versus DC, I really don't care. That's about the distribution system, and it depends what the loads are, what assets are already in place. You can even have a mixed system.
So in terms of financing, I'm a techie guy, so the financing is a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I do support the process when we do justifications. So again, there's two types of installations that I'm commonly involved with. Existing installations that we're doing a retrofit or grassroots new builds. So with new builds, it's a very different economic model, and I kind of want to stay out of those. My company, AECOM, has a concept of design, build, finance, and operate. So we do offer, as part of the overall package to build greenfield facilities, the financial package to support it. So in the retrofit topic, it's all based on a very structured concept of using a cost benefits analysis on your risk. So most people, again, if we take, so let's take a transportation system in a major city. It's very easy in those particular installations to calculate the cost of a loss of service, right? Both in terms of loss in revenue as well as loss in reputation and, the secondary impact to the community when a metro system stops running. So in those particular cases, all of the decisions that we make for the deployment of the technologies is always based on a cost against services and how we can improve those costs. And in general, the paybacks are within a few years. But as soon as we start to do long-term models, we start to see excessive capital gains over the long haul because of the improved resilience. Just a couple % of improvement in availability can generate significant returns from a capital investment point of view.
I'd definitely agree with Shalom in that sense that the longer term, the longer the term of the contract, the better it is. But what you mostly see, if you have multiple contracts within, say, one system, you generally see the energy contracts being around 20, 25 years. But capacity contracts, for example, if you're contracting to provide capacity to a utility, they're generally around 10 years. Again, these contractual terms, so most technologies like CHP systems, PV system, their engineering life is 25 years. But then for batteries, the life is 10 years, but then you can easily replace the cells within the batteries. So you can get warranties for things, or extend the supplier contracts for the technologies to 20, 25 years to coincide or go with the term of the revenue contract that you're making with the off-taker. I'll also take a stab at your question, Shalom. In the sense of this panel, what we see are, everywhere AC microgrids. People like Bosch, I think, are doing pretty innovative and interesting work in DC systems, but I don't think in DC microgrids, but the concept doesn't seem to be there yet, at least in kind of the safety, the public safety and the commercialization sense. But if you look at shipboard systems, which are microgrids, you would see a lot of progress. I mean, that's really where DC microgrids are, have been prevalent for years and years now.
Excuse me. The reason I asked that question was because if you look at Texas, the ERCOT system, it's all DC ties. So
Sure.
in order to get things in and out of that area, you have to go through that system. And they can either dial it up or dial it down to get the amount of amps in and out of that area. That's why I was asking.
Sure.
I think those were very good questions. We have another one over here.
Hi, my name is Craig Hart.
Mike there.
Sorry.
Thanks. My name is Craig Hart. I'm with the EPC program, Johns Hopkins University. My question concerns the transferability of solutions being developed here in the United States, technologies developed in the United States, and how those can be transferred to Asia, Africa, other countries. Could you talk a bit about some of the challenges in terms of are the solutions we're developing, are they easily transferred? How much does that impact things like the services element? And where are the learning curves that we have to deal with in terms of making these technologies something that we can export? Thanks.
That needs a whole nother symposium. So I'll be just very brief. In developed contexts, many of the solutions are not actually transferable, in part because some of the solutions are already in place. So district energy systems are very common in Europe. They provide, 40% of the energy in Denmark, et cetera. So they have city-sized microgrids in that sense. Also, a lot of the efficiency plays and so forth are already in place that aren't here. Also, you don't have the same necessarily kind of adversarial relationship sometimes between the microgrid and the macrogrid. It's a lot easier to do kind of strategic planning in a different political context when the utility is state-owned. Nonetheless, some things will still transfer. Then for the kind of rural electrification, the problem and the solutions look very different. I think that's actually the much bigger opportunity for microgrids over a multi-decade context. These are trillions worth of infrastructure investments that are going to be made. And instead of trying to replicate the big grid we have here, peer-to-peer network of microgrids makes a lot more sense. It's another leapfrogging case like the cell phones. And that's more of a bumper sticker answer, but that's all we can do here.
See, I would agree with Shalom. I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia and also in some of the sub-Saharan African countries. There are significant hurdles that would have to be overcome. Vietnam, for instance, has no grid. They have no macro grid. So everything is, in a sense, a city grid. Extremely unreliable, mainly because there is no oversight in how that works. So I do believe that the technologies could be applied, but because of the obstacles that are in place, because of the way that everything's state-run and state-owned, it may be a little bit more challenging. So.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we have, actually a majority of our projects, I'd say, are off-grid microgrid projects. We have a lot of projects in, for example, we are working in Arctic communities that are, that don't have energy access, in mining communities in South America. We do a lot of work in India and Southeast Asia, and actual islands. Conceptually, so we have different kinds of, I wouldn't say standard microgrids, but microgrid blueprints. And, some of the blueprints cannot be ported. For example, the dense urban CHP-based microgrid that you see in the Northeast, that may not be able to be ported. But some blueprints like diesel plus renewables, diesel plus solar plus storage can be ported. In fact, that's kind of the blueprint that we work on a lot. And then you have this huge market, apart from energy access microgrids, say for rural electrification, you have this tremendous market, which is essentially in places like India and say South Africa, you have mandatory load shedding, mandatory load curtailment because because of transmission congestion and because there's not enough generation to cover peak loads and so forth, and these run to hundreds of hours a year. So you have people, and there is microgrids based on even equipment with high capital costs makes a lot of sense there, because the market potential, the revenue potential, what the customers are willing to pay to cover that gap of say 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week when they know that they will get their power curtailed or power turned off is a lot. So the blueprint of say diesel engines, storage, and solar is it's I think really favorable in those.
Maybe this gives us an idea for another session. We have a question here.
No, my name is Fabian Nilsson. I'm from EDF. We're a big French utility company. I just wanted to add the Europe perspective on microgrid. And I think what makes the American microgrid model unique, especially compared to Europe, is the power market complexities. In the US, a microgrid can sell power to the market, to the ISO. They can sell frequency regulation and other ancillary services and make additional revenue. We estimate that 10 to 20% additional revenue if you manage to sell to the market. So this complexity of the market in the US allow additional revenue stream that, we don't have the same markets in Europe, and we can't get this revenue stream. This is one thing. Europe also has a way better quality network. The power network quality is better because we are smaller countries, of course, and resiliency is not such a big issue as in the US. So in the US, you can get additional revenue stream from resiliency. Not always, but sometimes customers are ready to pay for this resiliency issue. They already have, for instance, diesel or natural gas gensets that they're paying. So, if you propose the same service for half the cost, they would be ready to pay for it. So I would say that we believe that if microgrid happen, and I'm not talking about remote microgrids, in Africa, but it will start it will be a profitable business in the US, and it will start in the US.
If I could just pivot off of that,
Okay.
For a public service announcement that I'm obligated to give, because you're absolutely right. The revenue streams in the U.S. From the grid interactions can be very significant. They can be your entire profit margin that make the project doable. That's true for several different revenue streams. A microgrid really works by combining all of the elements of a value stack, and it can be complicated, and you may need some help in figuring that out. Thanks to Bill, Updike, and to Kyle, if you are looking at a potential microgrid project in DC itself, there is a new microgrid extension service that can help you figure this out, which is operated by Urban Ingenuity. There's a flyer out where you checked in. If we're out of the flyers because there's a lot of people here, just email me and we can get you the information.
Thanks, Shalom. Actually, I was going to ask you to talk more about that, so good timing.
Good.
Do we have more questions from the audience? We have one right here. Your hand was up first. If we have time, we'll get back to you.
It was mentioned earlier that,
Introduce yourself.
I'm Fred Hoover, I'm with the National Association of State Energy Officials. It was mentioned earlier that I guess you described library firehouse model for microgrids don't work. If states and local governments are interested in pursuing microgrids as part of a resiliency strategy, what is a model that might work for them?
Right. So first of all, microgrids don't work everywhere. They're not a universal solution. My kind of off-the-cuff number is somewhere around 10 to 20% of energy needs could be met cost-effectively with microgrids in the U.S. So that's appreciable, right? That's, I don't know how many billions of dollars worth of investment, but you can't just say, okay, what's the right microgrid for this spot? The answer might be none, right? Now, within that, you're looking for load concentrations, you're looking for sources of energy. Again, it's a customized solution. That's one of the great advantages of microgrids as opposed to the one-size-fits-all utility service. But it also means that you sometimes have to get creative or get expert help in order to spot where those opportunities are. So I can't really give you a universal answer.
The one idea that's floating around is that if the resilient community resiliency microgrid that you mentioned, if it's that concept, there might be a case for to rate base that community resiliency microgrid. The kind of microgrids that Connecticut is now is advocating and Massachusetts is advocating. I mean, the concept. I mean, as in the private development sense and in the commercial sense, it's hard to to consistently be profitable for private players in that category of microgrids. So there is the idea floating around that it might be those might be classified as resiliency assets and rate basing it.
See, another thing in line with that and kind of bouncing off Shalom's comments, it's really important that we make sure that we have energy sources near energy consumers, right? And that's why I agree that not a microgrid won't work everywhere. For instance, in the Southwest, we do have abundant sun, so we've got great opportunity, though they may not have the wide-scale access to natural gas or diesels or all of those because of pipeline deficiencies. They do have solar. But in other parts of the country, they might have neither, right? They might have, it's difficult to get fossil fuels to them, because of current regulations and obstacles around that and doing new infrastructure to support that. And they may also lack the ability to have the renewables, whether it's wind, solar, so on.
And then we'll come back to you back there.
Stephanie Sau, energy reporter with S&P Global. Just had a question for all panelists, not specific, whoever wants to jump in. What are you hearing or any concerns on a federal level? Because we hear a lot about infrastructure now, maybe prospects on a federal level. We also hear potential funding risk changes for renewables, which I'm still brand new to microgrids, but it sounds like it's closely tied to solar development. And I don't know if you hear any changes in the microgrid space under this new administration, or do you see more interest then on a traditional model going back to gas as opposed to renewables if there's less funding on the renewable sides? And also we talked a little bit about what is the risk of not doing microgrids. Can you just talk about what are some of the main competitors, I guess, to microgrids if there is one?
Well, to start, I'll take that last part. Obviously, the competitor is leaving as is, the status quo as it exists today. I mean, the grid is operational, it's mature, it's reasonably stable and reliable. So really the option is not changing what you currently have. Now there are, as we go back into the information world, there is a significant problem that's now on the rise, and that is the enormous power loads that they're expecting over the next 20 years because of the increase in data centers and the horsepower that these big data systems are going to require. So municipalities are now starting to look at this from a what are we going to do, because it's very expensive to put data centers in urban areas because of the power consumption, the building loads that they currently have to face, and all of the supporting. We've got cooling issues, we've got cost of real estate. So what's happening is more and more of these data centers are starting to move out into the remote rural areas, depending on the transmission network rather than the distribution network, which is far more reliable. So cities are having to deal with these decisions right now. How are we going to manage our power loads over the next 10, 20 years? Because we may think that we're actually driving it down because of more efficient lighting and more efficient heating and cooling. We're actually adding this enormous new technological load to the power infrastructure that we're going to see.
Maybe I can take a stab at the first question. So we expect most of the regulatory activity to come from the states at this point. But the primary source of incentives for solar and wind are your ITC, investment tax credits, and that's in place till 2020. You also have investment tax credits on storage that are co-located, batteries that's co-located with solar and that charging exclusively from solar. Regarding federal, apart from incentives, regarding regulatory activity, there is a docket in FERC that's talking about providing access to behind-the-meter energy resources, which are customer-installed energy resources, to the ISO markets. And the individual ISOs, like PJM and Cal ISO, they have been working on this issue, and they have had regulatory proceedings around this for several years. Essentially, how to enable and what would maybe the requirements for allowing small-scale behind-the-meter resources to participate in open market ISO services. And that's really, really very pertinent to microgrids.
Shalom, do you want to add?
I just reinforce what Sudipta just said about access for small-scale generation assets to the larger markets, including not just transmission scale markets, but what's happening within a local distribution system and what the value is that those local resources can provide, and especially in terms of non-wires alternatives, to essentially be able to rate base the benefits of distributed generation resources and microgrids.
question from up here on the auditorium.
Hi, thanks. Miles Kiger, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I'm here in my personal capacity. I appreciate the prior question. Stepping back to first things, can you all just elaborate on the scope of the definition of what a microgrid is, and to sort of clarify what the essential elements are for why many different systems would qualify as a microgrid? Because it sounds like it's part distribution, part generation, maybe transmission. And then also, can you also elaborate on the different commercialization or monetization models for each one of those types of systems? Thanks.
Yeah, and if we could come up with a consistent definition that we could just use across the states, I think that would be helpful. So,
Oh, I don't know. I'd say a collection of loads and resources that can act coherently and collectively with respect to each other and with respect to the larger grid.
I like that.
I'd just add one point to that. You know, they can island and operate autonomously. So in my mind, the primary, you have concepts like virtual power plants. You have concepts of aggregated resources that through sophisticated controls that may be geographically and electrically dispersed, but through sophisticated controls, you can aggregate and provide services in unison. But microgrids, in my mind, should be able to provide that key resiliency function. That is, they can provide electric power to underlying loads when there is an outage in the main grid. So in my mind, that is kind of a key feature in the definition of microgrids.
See, I knew three of us would come about this three different angles. Because for me, I like the example that talks about generation, transmission, distribution. Because when I think of microgrid, that collapses down, and it is just one single integrated. There really isn't that demarcation anymore. Because again, most of the projects in the systems that we're currently evaluating are very isolated. They're very small, right? So they're designed for let's say a campus. Let's not get to just a single building, but a group of buildings. So in a sense, it's got its own contained generation. There really isn't a transmission mechanism because there's no need to raise voltages, right? So we generate at the voltage levels that we need to support the infrastructure, and then we immediately distribute it. So I kind of view it as a collapsed single entity now, which would be fun to think of a clever word that would combine all of those.
Regarding the second part of your question, regarding the revenue sources, in what you have in what we call the MUSH microgrid market, which is your campus type of microgrid, military, university, school, hospital. So what you have are essentially savings, operational savings generated from inherent efficiency at load. So you were spending so many dollars on electric energy demand, thermal. Now you're spending less amount of dollars, and that's the main operational revenue source, and that's your main saving source. What we are starting to see are, in addition to operational savings, there are contracts being made and new revenue sources coming to the market in the sense of, say, reliability contracts being drawn with potential customers who have needs for a higher level of reliability than what the grid or what their existing system is providing. What we are also really excited about is some contracts and some cases we are seeing where the microgrid is providing over-the-meter services. So microgrid might get into a contract with the utility to provide a capacity resource, which is essentially the ISO asks the utility for for some curtailment resource, and then the utility asks the microgrid to say dispatch or say generate so much megawatts over this duration. And these are like long-term, very sustainable contracts. The financiers love it, and it's easy for the microgrid to provide that. So I think like combination of all these things is really exciting.
And I would add to that that there are a lot of costs that don't show up on the monthly utility bills that are essential for the economic foundation of many microgrids. And if you only look at both the offset of what you didn't have to pay for your utilities and the revenues you might earn from providing services and exports to the larger utilities, you're still going to miss a lot of opportunities that really do make sense. So just two quick examples. If you're dealing with new construction, and it's a microgrid that has thermal services, then if you don't need to put in boilers and chillers in each individual building, that's a big savings. You've got to include that in your formula. And similarly, as we were just saying in the FERC context, if you don't have to build the next substation because you're building microgrids, that's a huge savings. You've got to find a regulatory way to value that and put it into the equation for the microgrid.
Mike, we have a question right here.
Just a follow-up question for Sudipta. Hi, my name is Rima Owaid. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy. So just a question for Sudipta. When you said that there were contracts that are being made between the utility and the microgrid for these additional services, is this being done outside of ISOs, outside of the ISO markets, or are these like independent contracts that are being made?
These are bilateral contracts.
Bilateral with the utility outside, so it's outside of the ISO markets?
Well, the ISO market, there's no real like contractual, I mean, you can't, it's an open market. You opportunistically may participate in providing services to the ISO market. In addition to that, you can also go into a bilateral contract with the utility, who is a participating member at an ISO, to say provide some sort of distribution service or some sort of capacity service.
Is that a growing trend? Are microgrids better off doing bilateral contracts with the utilities versus playing in the markets?
You can do both. The beauty about microgrids is that you can do both. You can do as well while doing your energy and demand charge savings and thermal savings. Controllers are sophisticated enough to allow you to like optimize and schedule and all these things. The good thing about bilateral contracts is that you have fixed locked revenue,
right?
And the financiers love it. So you can really get project financing based on those contracts.
Right. One last question: would it be, given that microgrids are very customized because they don't, work everywhere, but there is this growing interest among state and local governments in pursuing microgrids, particularly for protecting critical assets and facilities, do you think it's helpful to develop a playbook for state and locals, given that it is so difficult to generalize?
So I'd say absolutely. And in fact, when DC developed this idea of microgrid extension services, it was explicitly modeled on the federal level agricultural extension services. People need help to figure this out, and they need resources and expertise, especially that has at least a veneer of being unbiased. There are also playbooks that are available, and I'll just point out one. The International District Energy Association did one a few years ago for how communities can go about planning a microgrid or a district energy system, and it's quite good.
I think we have time for one more question. I see one hand.
Hi, I'm Fahad. I'm with the think tank called Third Way. I just want a brief opinion of the panel on nuclear small modular reactors on applications for microgrid, because they are getting a lot of attention in the nuclear community, but I don't see a lot of attention in the microgrid community. So just on the panel's opinion on that.
Speaking as someone who is trained as a nuclear engineer, when that came up earlier this morning, I turned to Joel and said, maybe by 2100.
Hopefully before that. Any other comments about small modular nuclear? So we're going to have a whole nother event about nuclear at a later date. Any other questions? If not, I think we've had a very good discussion of the challenges, the opportunities, some of the key drivers and things that cities should think about, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our expert panel here for this discussion.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Donna Attanasio. I'm Senior Advisor for Energy Law Programs here at the Law School. And first of all, I guess I'd like not only to thank all of you for coming, but also to extend my thanks to the GW Sustainability Collaborative and the Duke Energy Renewables Innovation Fund, which provided the backing for this project. I regret that we had our third author here in the room, and he seems to have disappeared on us again. Is Deo still out there? Get him. We really did have 3 authors on this. In fact, we probably could have included Janet as an author too, except her name didn't start with a D. So we there's Deo. So here's our third author, who is responsible for the linear programming portion of our paper, and then Doug and I, or the other 2, of course. But as we've talked already this morning, you know, you've seen one microgrid, you've seen one microgrid. Our last panel was very helpful in filling out some of the technical aspects. This panel, we're going to turn to actually looking at some microgrids that are up and running, some real live examples, and again, because they're also individual, I think it's very important that we have quite a diversity of different kinds of projects that are represented here today. So following Janet's lead, I am not going to read you the full bios. I'm just going to try to give you enough information that you can understand a little bit about where people are coming from. So I guess starting here on my left, Kevin. Kevin Self is Senior Vice President Strategy for Business Development and Government Relations at Schneider Electric. He's responsible for the development and execution of strategy across all lines of business in alignment with Schneider Electric's recently launched Life is On corporate brand. I love that. Including leading the overall North American strategy development process, leading their smart cities efforts, developing and maximizing government relations, maximizing government relationships at state and federal levels and identifying inorganic growth opportunities. Kyle, I think you've already gotten a couple of nods so far this morning. Kyle is the Energy Policy and Compliance Analyst at DC Department of Energy and Environment. DC, by the way, has been very, very active in a number of these sectors. I think sometimes people tend to think about federal and state actions and not so much about local actions. Well, I'm happy to say that here in DC, we do have a very active Department of Energy and Environment. So Kyle works closely with policymakers, rate makers, business, and utilities to achieve the district's energy system goals. This work includes drafting comments on behalf of the District of Columbia government and regulatory proceedings, analyzing legislative initiatives, and managing grant programs. His area of practice is multidisciplinary, blending quantitative and qualitative skills to enable sustainable change in the district. He has experience with other governments as well, including working with the Maryland Energy Administration and the U.S. Army's Office of Energy Initiatives. And I know in our pre-conversations, we did cross all of those boundaries. So I'm anxious to have that dimension brought to us today, too. Tom Fenimore, Technology Development Manager at Duke Energy. Tom has been with Duke for over 20 years in a variety of roles, including customer operations, commercial industrial energy efficiency, and the Emerging Technology Office. He currently leads projects in cutting-edge technology, including microgrids, energy storage and distributed energy resources, distributed generation control algorithm development, and advanced demand response systems. And of course, as we've already talked about a little bit this morning, there's a lot of crossover across those areas. And then lastly, at the end of our table here, so it seems like a long way down there, we have Pete Fuller. Pete is a Vice President, Market and Regulatory Policy, NRG Energy. Pete leads policy development at NRG's state, regional, and federal regulatory and policy activities, primarily in New England, New York, and PJM market areas. His work includes wholesale market design, climate change and related environmental policies, renewable and distributed energy policy, and the intersection of public policy objectives with competitive markets. We started very early today, and I'm really not a morning person. But with that, I'd like to follow the same format as we did last time. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give you 5 to 7 minutes or so of introductory remarks with a little bit of background about the kinds of projects they've been working on. And then I'll have some questions for them, and then we hope to open it up to all of you to add to that. So we'll just work our way down the row here. Kevin.
Very good. Thanks, Donna. So let me tell a quick story that actually I stole from an executive at Exelon. I heard it about a year ago. I steal things. Stories only, though. And so his story was assumed today that Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell both sort of woke up. and sort of say, well, what's happening in the year 2017? And Alexander Graham Bell would say, 100 years ago, I built this telephone, where are these? And everyone would pull these out of their pockets. You would say, wow, this is an industry that has dramatically changed. Thomas Edison would go outside, see the power line still in existence, say, yep, nothing has changed. And I would argue that few industries go unchanged for 100 years. And I think what you're beginning to see, if you go up to a higher level, is beginning chaos within the U.S. and global energy markets, addressing exactly what we're talking about today. So I'm with Schneider Electric. We're a $28 billion, 180-year-old company that began in France, now very, very global. Our CEO co-chairs the World Economic Forum's Future of Electricity with Francesco Staracci, the CEO of Enel. And so at Davos this year, they sort of laid out a program of what's happening globally, and the belief is over the next 10 years, there's over $3 trillion of net economic value that's going to be added based on this chaos and this change that's ongoing from a global basis. And one other quick story for outside the U.S. is we, Schneider Electric, are actually very involved, and I'd argue microgrids or mini-grids occurring within India and Africa. Have been doing it for about 8 years, bought a company in 2011 called Luminous Power Technologies in India, and we're building 100 to 150 of these a year, focused around schools. So when the children do come to school, they do have power, they are able to access some energy benefits. And so, we don't talk about it much here in the U.S., but we have a huge aspiration to provide electricity for the 1.2 billion people on this planet that have no access today. Specifically in regards to the U.S., we actually partner very closely with Duke Energy, so very happy to have Duke on the panel, and actually in February announced a microgrid that we're putting in place near here in Montgomery County, Maryland. Within the public services groups. I think there's actually 2 microgrids going in, and the issue that they had was they started looking at their electrical gear and realized it was from the 1960s, and it was starting to fall apart, so they needed to replace it. Then they realized, well, gosh, if we're gonna fix that, we also have resiliency issues. X number of times a year we lose power, so let's solve that at the same time. And so we worked hand in hand with Duke Energy. It'll be launched, I believe, in 2018, and we consider it microgrid as a service, where actually Montgomery County, Maryland is not having to dole out any initial capital expenditures. Duke's gonna own the assets and basically sell them energy as a service. And we're seeing examples of that across the U.S. There are still those entities, more Department of Defense bases that do look at a CapEx opportunity. But we are seeing a number of business models under experimentation right now. Specifically, is we look at microgrids. I'd sort of break them into 3 groups. There are the municipalities that are looking at it. Montgomery County, Maryland's an example. There's also the Department of Defense bases. We actually announced one last August with Miramar Air Force Base out in California. And then there's also a number of growing corporations that are realizing that they are going to demand clean energy regardless of what this administration might be pushing forward, as they're trying to attract the millennials and the talent base they need. And so a number of large automotive manufacturers are talking to us about how they drive greater clean energy, and thus how do they also get involved in renewables and microgrids. So an ongoing discussion. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kyle Haas. I wanted to start by making sure that I thanked GW and NC2ES. I have a really exciting group of colleagues up here to have a discussion with. I might have the longest title, but certainly not the most impressive. And I'm not, I'm really excited to hear about your projects in India and all of those initiatives. But I've worked at a couple different organizations, as you outlined, and the second thing I'd like to do is to say that I've worked with some really great people, some of whom are in the room right now, who have worked on these projects with me or helped me to work on these projects. And that type of thing, and seeing this group here, is the most exciting part about it. So I wanted to make sure that I thanked everybody who's around this space. I'm excited to talk about microgrids today, not only because they're a super exciting resilience and reliability technology, but also they're a really great way to talk about the changes that are happening in the energy system that a number of the speakers have referenced. They're engaging, they're tangible. People can think, hey, what happened when the power went out? Who was still up, right? That's very engaging and tangible, and it can help to have discussions with policymakers and building owners and anybody you want in a really less abstract way. So that's why I'm really excited that this is a group of government and industry to sort of collaborate and have these discussions. So I wanted to start out with a couple quick examples of projects we've worked on. One of them at the Maryland Energy Administration was the Conterra project. It's actually up right off Route 95. It's a 300 kW, 400 kilowatt hour solar plus storage microgrid. It's the PV America project of the year for, I think, 2014. And they really explored some of these concepts that everybody's talking about, the concepts that I'll explore a little bit more that I call stackable benefits. So the projects that we're seeing be developed and be successful and be financeable, they look at a variety of value streams that they can offer to the end user or the grid, and how they can either monetize that or turn that into something that is really tangible. So another example that I'll give is the FDA facility. They have a 55 megawatt microgrid in White Oak, Maryland. This is the perfect example, right? So you have, imagine you're an FDA employee, you're a scientist, you're doing some experiment or culture or project, and if the grid goes out, if you lose power, you lose air conditioning, or you lose some sort of climate control in your test area, there's a monetary loss associated with that, right? So they have an inherent value of resilience as their foundation. And then what they did was they said, well, how can we turn that into additional values? How can we leverage our existing regulatory schemes and policies to make this work? So they're also saving 50,000 tons of CO2 per year, $3 million in demand savings. And these are real, tangible, quantifiable benefits that have made projects like these successful. So when I think about these projects, I just want to go real quickly into the stackable benefits that I think some of the other panelists have gone into, but the concept of peak shaving, the concept of load shifting, the concept of self-consumption, right? All of those values can be monetized or not in different regulatory and policy landscapes. So I've worked at Maryland, I've worked for the District of Columbia. They're both in PJM's network. They're both within the PJM service territory. So they're able to participate in frequency regulation markets, right? So once you start layering these additional value streams, you really get to a more financeable and tangible outcome for that. So how are we leveraging this in DC, right? Resilience is obviously a priority. Considering all of the very critical assets that are around here, the district is looking to deploy microgrids and resilient energy systems that support the existing macro grid. Not to disrupt or sort of, I mean, you do want to disrupt the business model, but you don't want to lose the value that you have from the sunken capital assets of our distribution network. That's very valuable. So how can we leverage these multiple benefits to deploy microgrids in a way that can provide stackable benefits? Step one from the policy and regulatory side is provide clear policy and regulatory guidance. That does not exist because 100 years ago, we developed a system for regulating and deploying energy that's not the reality anymore. So that's the first piece, is that policymakers need to make a decision. Do we want a distributed system that has dynamic resilience capabilities, or do we want to focus on a single point? And I think that's a decision that some public service commissions and legislators and executive decision makers are beginning to consider, but that's really one of the biggest challenges from my side. And the other is economic signals for the stackable benefits that these technologies can offer. Until we have clear tariffs or policies or grants or whatever you want to round that up in, you have to translate your policy priorities into some sort of economic signal. And again, that has currently not been done. So we have a lot of progress. We're working with some great teams. Shalom has already identified a number of the initiatives that we're working on in DC. And another thing that if you're online or you want to look into, the developments at Walter Reed, the redeveloping Walter Reed Hospital. And there's an exciting opportunity for a microgrid there. So I hope I didn't go over my time. And I'll pass it off there.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Tom Fenimore, and I work for Duke Energy in the Emerging Technology Office. I'm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. For those of you that may not know much about Duke Energy, we serve roughly 21 to 25 million people. Utilities have often referred to our customers as we serve 7 million customers, and in that case, the customer is the meter. So we're extending that now to those beyond the meter because we actually have live people beyond the meter. And if you look at us across 6 states where our electrical footprint is, we serve roughly 21 to 25 million-ish people throughout those states that we serve. As I said, I work in the Emerging Technology Office. We're a group of roughly 18 people inside of Duke Energy that essentially look at leading edge technologies and those technologies that are coming into the grid and work with those technologies and the vendors in the space and the stakeholders and the policymakers in that space to help understand what the influence of those technologies might be on the electric utility in the regulated, investor-owned, vertically integrated utility spaces that Duke primarily serves, but also in the unregulated space that we also serve in the PJM market in Ohio and the MISO market in the Midwest that we serve through Indiana. So we have basically a footprint in each one of the markets, and our job in emerging technology is to work in the vendor space and in some cases actually pilot and build out test cases to understand how the technology operates. Does it defy the laws of physics? Because we get approached by everybody in the space that's a vendor in this space, bringing their technology to us and saying, we need Duke Energy to pilot this. You're the largest utility out there, and we want you to pilot this and help us understand how this could be a benefit to your customers. And in many cases, we're able to accommodate that. But there are so many vendors in this space right now approaching us with technology that we simply aren't able to accommodate all of the pilots that folks would like us to run currently, which is kind of a nice problem to have. So what do we do with all that information? Well, my job basically consists of about 30% of my time devoted to actually being in the field with mud on my boots, turning a screwdriver, which are the happiest days of my job because I get to actually make this stuff work. And in some cases, find out that it doesn't work or the combination of technologies doesn't work. Because most microgrids, as you've heard people talk about here today, are a combination of greenfield and brownfield equipment. And the integration challenge of making all of that equipment work, either grid connected or islanded, is really a challenge. So, but actually that's the part of my job that I truly love to do. I love all of it, but if I had to rank it, that's number one. Secondly, I get to work with the different vendors in the space and collaborate with them to help improve their technology that they're delivering by being able to deliver test results from the pilots that we run, and then also work with our university partnerships in the research projects that we have, along with folks in the electric industry like EPRI and other research-oriented people in our industry. Thirdly, as part of my job, and these are about a third of my time, I get to act as a consultant internally to our business units. We have business units in the commercial space, as Kevin was referring to. We have a commercial operation that basically operates outside of our regulated territories. It is a separate LLC of Duke Energy that is able to go out and invest in microgrids and in renewable technologies throughout the country. We own roughly 2,000 megawatts of wind throughout the country and operate that and deliver that to the grid. We have solar projects, the 50% of the energy that is delivered here to GWU and this area is delivered by our commercial group through a PPA, a long-term agreement. So I consult and work with those folks, and it is a pleasure to be able to take our learnings and take it to them to help them when they're building out projects and considering business cases. We also have our regulated space where we consult and are able to help them. I'm pleased to say that in our regulated space, we're deploying our first DC microgrid in the Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina at a National Park Service antenna and communications tower at the top of a mountain. There were 4 miles of distribution line that is going to be taken out of service there and returning roughly, I think it's 40-some acres of space back to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park that was occupied by the distribution line going up that mountain. So we're actually going to commission that next month and bring it online in May. We have many other opportunities in the smart cities area with the city of Charlotte. They're at the 30% design phase for their critical infrastructure, critical emergency management operation, which will house their fire and police and emergency response facilities in Charlotte, working with them. Duke University, military bases all across our footprint. And then finally, in the community and residential area, we're very active. We're currently testing Tesla Powerwall and Enphase batteries at our Mount Holly Technical Center to understand what the opportunities are there to be able to potentially provide that as a service going forward to our residential customers. And then specifically in the Emerging Technology Office, we have pilots that we are running. The McAlpine Microgrid, or the Fire Station 24 Microgrid, that was built out over a 2-year period in South Charlotte, was our first distribution-based microgrid where the energy storage and solar provides a backup generation service for the City of Charlotte Fire Station 24. As one of the other folks in the earlier panel mentioned, that is not an economic model that one wants to pursue on your own. However, what we were proving there was a technology proof of concept, and I'll be happy to elaborate on that later if need be. And last but not least, we have a full medium voltage lab in our Mount Holly Technical Center just outside of Charlotte, where we are deploying microgrid technologies around solar storage and generation, and then also control system technology, so we can explore these technologies, deep dive on them, and truly understand them when it comes time to commercialize this as an offer for our customers going forward. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And so lastly.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Donna. Pete Fuller with NRG, and I'm bucking all kinds of trends today. I didn't get the memo about no ties. I got the memo, but thought a couple of slides would actually be helpful. So I hope you can put up with a little bit of a show as well as a tell here. Just to start off, NRG is a very large independent power producer. It varies from day to day whether we're the largest in the nation, but about somewhere around a 50 gigawatt portfolio, all kinds of technologies, nuclear, wind, solar, coal, gas, not a lot of hydro, but otherwise we pretty much cover the spectrum. Also a very large provider of retail electricity in the competitive markets, Texas and across the Northeast. Leading developer and owner and operator of wind and solar, as we're looking to transition from those legacy assets that we purchased in the deregulation wave 10, 15, 20 years ago, and move into the new realm of the grid. And along with that, I think unique in the independent power space, NRG has made a commitment to reduce our carbon emissions from our 2014 level by 50% by 2030 and 90% by 2050. So we're continually working on that, of how we phase out of the high carbon projects and into lower and lower carbon. In fact, we very recently commissioned I think the first working large-scale carbon capture and sequestration project in Texas. And if I say that in public, I always have to say on time and under budget. We're extremely proud that we were able to get that done and actually begin proving out that technology as well. So a couple of pictures that, I don't know where I point this, but I guess I can do that. We skip the lawyers. The pictures that I really thought would be helpful to have today, just to give us all a little visual to focus on. This is our new headquarters building up in Princeton, New Jersey. And if you're at all interested, we'd love to have visitors and show it all off. And honestly, much like Tom said, some of these things aren't what you would do on a purely economic basis. This is a bit of a billboard and a showcase for NRG, for sustainability, for both technology and where we think the whole place is going. So we've got solar panels on the roof, solar thermal on the roof. It's a green roof. We've got rainwater capture that we recycle for building non-potable use. We've got wind turbines out front. We've got electric vehicle charging stations. We've got more solar panels over the parking canopy. And then that circular area up in the upper right is sort of the heart and soul of the older technology, but brought forward. We've got diesel in there. We've got a gas CHP in there, and we've also got about 500 kW of batteries. So this is fully islandable and sustainable in that way. But frankly, to me, and as you'll see as we go forward here, what we're really working on is, and I think Shalom mentioned it earlier today, is it's not just about backup, and it's really not primarily about that island capability. It really is about the day-to-day blue sky operations. So we've got a blue pillar control system that we're continuing to refine and work with the local utility and with PJM in terms of what we're drawing from the grid and what we're able to offset. And we can talk more about some of the barriers. There are some issues here about and we're very limited in what we can export just because of some of the tariff issues. So I think, that those are some ongoing issues that we'll need to work out, people will need to work out on all of these projects. But, and again, a really cool example of how you can mesh it all together and, use the control system to really optimize day in and day out, minute to minute. The other pictures I wanted to show, another good example, and this one's a couple years old now, so it's past a lot of the shakedown that the headquarters building is still going through. Just up the road in Princeton Plainsboro Hospital, a critical care facility, air handling and air turnover is a big issue there, and we're basically providing them soup to nuts in space conditioning, electricity, gas service, the whole bit. And again, I think it really embodies the idea that a well-designed microgrid, or even without the islandable capability, the ability to tie it all together with multiple sorts of resources, with storage. In this case, it's thermal storage, no battery storage, and be able to tie that all together and, again, optimize moment to moment in terms of which of the resources are being used, what's being drawn from the grid, and so forth. We also have a number of combined heat and power facilities that these are not islandable, and this begins sort of the segue from the way we're thinking about this stuff. And I know this is a microgrid panel, but I'll be a heretic yet again. We think more and more about the blue sky aspect of this, and really what can we do with distributed resources? What can we do with, CHP or other things? And it's only when that customer really, really needs to get to the islandable, self-sustaining operation. If they really value that, we can certainly do it. But we're seeing a lot more promise and value, frankly, in working in that first step of DERs that either on-site or, as was mentioned a little bit ago, across geographies, we can aggregate and control and, again, gain that additional value either for the local utility grid or the larger wholesale markets. And the last point that I wanted just to get out on the table here is, as we're thinking about all this stuff, and clearly, we're an independent third-party provider. We have no rate base, no regulated rate recovery. But we've been thinking about this issue for a long time and have continued to struggle in states that are moving ahead, be it California, New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, D.C. There's a very strong desire, an understandable desire, and on the part of the incumbent utilities to say, well, we are the energy provider here. This is what we do. We should be in this business. We should get in this business. And partly because we want the business, but I think really from a public policy perspective and from a, thinking about the transformation of the industry overall, we look at that and say, utilities have a lot of things they need to do to get ready and to beef up for this new distributed future. So more metering, more communications, more sensing, more self-healing, more smart grid operations, and so forth. The tremendous amount of investment that needs to be made. That's going to put upward pressure on rates. DERs, by their very nature, microgrids by their very nature, tend to put downward pressure on sales for utilities. And so we just see it as, a real working at odds with what we think ought to be going on, of utilities being very careful with the investments they have to make, very careful with what gets added to rate base, so that it's focused on the things that they are clearly and definitively set up to do the monopoly services that really don't lend themselves to competition, and look at DERs and those other services that are going to require investment, really drawing from the customer investment side or third parties bringing it in. So that's what I wanted to sort of get out on the table, and I really look forward to questions and the discussion. So.
This is terrific. I think we've got a nice array of experiences up here to draw on. The first thing I'd like to do is I might torture my students this way too. I really do like to get down to the nitty-gritty. I'd really like to understand the financial models behind some of these. Now, we understand, for example, the firehouse is not necessarily an economic one. There's other reasons to do that. But we've talked about the stack of values, and we're seeing more and more public-private type partnerships, et cetera. Who's providing equity? Who's providing financing? What are these revenue streams that you're tapping into? Where's the money coming from? And where are the obstacles? What are the things you can't tap into? You mentioned, tariff issues. Can you all elaborate a little bit and really help us get our hands around the finances behind these, where they are today and where they need to go to? Anyone want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it. And it's kind of all over the place depending upon what business model we're looking at. So let's start with our commercial group, and our commercial group kind of being a unregulated, free-to-roam group outside our territory. Typically, we enter into a long-term contract to own and operate those assets, and then deliver the energy from those assets of the microgrid to the customer under a purchase power agreement. And that's a relatively straightforward business case that is, in place, and in our Schneider projects is working well for us. So we'll continue to pursue that where those opportunities allow us to.
So you're really looking there for the customer to find the value and be able to pass it on to you in the PPA.
Correct. And, if there are market mechanisms like PJM or other markets where we can deliver ancillary services as part of that outside of strictly a kilowatt-hour sales arrangement, obviously fold those in, to the business case as well.
But are you finding those markets? Is PJM buying those things?
I can't say directly as part of a microgrid at this point, but I can say that in the PJM market, we own and operate 4 megawatts of frequency response or frequency regulation batteries in Ohio, okay, as a Duke-owned project on our regulated side. And that project performance to date has been favorable in the PJM market, strictly energy storage with delivering a service to the PJM market. Somewhat separate from a microgrid, but nonetheless testing out that financial model arrangement. So we continue to work through that and understand that. And, as a utility, you have to understand that we're long-term focused. We're used to supplying capital and plowing it into the ground and getting a return back over 50 years. So there's not many businesses that ask you to step forward and plow your money into the ground and leave it there for 50 years. But on the flip side of that, in a regulated environment, we also typically get a more or less guaranteed rate of return on that. So it's a two-sided coin. And we need to work through that model in the regulated space to understand how do we take an asset that has a customer-side benefit such as backup service or resiliency or demand charge management, whatever these customer-side opportunities might be from microgrids, and then take that same asset and provide grid-side benefits such as frequency regulation, congestion relief, and other grid-side operations that the utility might want to operate that microgrid for, and figure out the financial model for that and blend that into a regulated rate structure that is used to coming up with a single cents per kilowatt hour number at the end of the day. That's something we're working through internally. That is an enormous, enormous task inside of a regulated utility that is used to looking at all of our generation assets, all of our cost of capital, depreciation, that entire model of all of our assets and operating expenses across all of our circuits, generation, transmission, all the way down to the end, and then coming up with a single cents per kilowatt hour number that we sell our electricity to our customers. How do we take microgrids suddenly which has not only this customer side benefit, but also a grid side benefit to the utility, and make that model work in a way that's fair and equitable to all of our ratepayers. Not an easy task, but one that we're undertaking, okay? One that we're in the middle of, and we're not complete and out of the woods on that, but the conversations are taking place, and regulators are engaged. I'm pleased to say that our regulatory folks at our state level are completely engaged in that conversation and know that we are changing a financial model that has been relatively fixed for the last 100 years. So I'd love to tell you it's straightforward, but it's not.
Yeah, let's let others jump in on this too.
go ahead.
I can see people start twitching around the table.
And I'm hoping to set everyone else up right here. This is about, like I said before, a bigger change in our energy system, right? We have policymakers and regulators all talking about where is our energy going to be sourced from? Is it going to be coal? Is it going to be solar? And I think that I get the opportunity to sort of step back from the box that especially regulated utilities have to work within, but everyone in the market. And I get to ask the question to policymakers and decision makers, what is the energy system you want, right? We have an existing system. It has traditionally been centralized, and you distribute power to your load sources. Do you want it to be cleaner? Do you want it to be more reliable? If you want these things, you have to give both regulated utilities and the deregulated market players clear guidelines to do that. Because just saying, I want more solar on the grid is not an energy policy. It's not. So what you need to do is you need to take a look at how these technologies are being deployed, work with industry to understand what they need, and then craft your incentives, your market incentives to do that. And hopefully that is something people can respond to.
Yeah,
And I
maybe.
think they're going to.
Yeah, maybe to follow up, first off, to my earlier comments, I think we are much closer to the very beginning of this change than towards the end. This is a nascent, new, emerging. These, in my mind, are experiments. And you can look at the different states of what's going on. Go take a look at the state of Nevada with big customers walking away from their utility to go it on their own. The way we think about it within Schneider is energy is becoming, it's sort of these 3Ds, more decarbonized, more digitized, and more decentralized. And that is going to then drive more power to the end consumer. And if you really look at those end consumers, and we've sort of hit at it here, they're trying to solve for three things we believe, and it's sort of on three different axes. One is, pure cost. They may just want what's the lowest cost I can get. They might want 100% resiliency regardless of the cost, or they might want 100% sustainability regardless of the cost. And so those are the three, and as we talk to customers, that's what they're trying to solve for, and it's sort of how they value each of those drives, what they want to put into place. In regards to financing, similar to Tom's comment, we're working very closly with the non-regulated arm of Duke, looking at a number of opportunities. So that's one opportunity. The other is we're beginning to see them in the U.S. outside investors who have interest in this U.S. energy market as it's changing to get more involved and to invest. Nothing's really come with us at this point, but a lot of interested parties who want to get in the game and understand how this is going to evolve in the coming years.
So much to my final point, I think, the struggle that the regulated utilities having of meshing a customer value, for a limited group of customers with a grid value, a market value, and figuring that all out, I think it's not the definitive answer, but it's another piece of the puzzle why we think there's a real role for non-regulated, competitive entities in that realm. I think the model that we're looking for as well is not all that dissimilar. We're looking at whether it's the Princeton Hospital or some of the CHPs or other DERs that we're looking at. As much as we can, it's a long-term service agreement, and it's not even necessarily a PPA. We're looking at what are we providing, and again, if it's water, air, gas, energy, steam, which I think is a Schneider acronym. If we're providing a full wrap like that, then we want some kind of a bundled payment that reflects that, and then it's all on us to deliver that, whatever it takes, new equipment, what have you, keeping the performance up. I forget where exactly I was going with that, but I think having that kind of customer value, and I think the as I mentioned, there are local utility tariff issues, the FERC NOPR that's going on with respect to storage and distributed resource aggregations participating in wholesale markets, I think is indicative of the fact that those rules and markets really are not there yet. There's a theoretical access to a lot of those revenue streams, and in some cases a practical access, but in many cases it's still kind of theoretical or extremely hard to work out. So I think those kind of rules, getting those in place, getting people more comfortable that either at the local level, the way New York and others are looking at, the value of distribution and the value that distributed resources are providing to the local utility grid, and that ability to access wholesale market revenues, those need to become a lot more certain for people to bank on them. But that's certainly where, I think a lot of our policy work is going.
Kevin mentioned outside investors beginning to get interested in this area. Are any of you seeing outside investors willing to come in this, like commercial lenders came into the project finance market? Are we any place close to that yet?
I'm out of my depth a little bit. I don't work that closely in finance, but, we tend to look at most of these projects, starting with our own balance sheet. If there's tax credits, we're looking for a tax equity partner. But to my knowledge, and I got to caveat that, I haven't seen, the investors beating down the doors looking for these things. But I don't think, at the same time, I don't think there's a real lack if you want to go find a finance partner. There are people who are definitely willing to look at this stuff.
Before we go to the audience, and I do want to get to your question shortly, could we just go down the road and talk again a little bit about this? As you can tell, our paper focused on sort of the regulatory and financial barriers. I was the regulatory person. So what we found was pretty much we couldn't find much that dealt specifically with microgrids. Some very vague references, maybe some statutes for green banks that would lend to them, but we weren't really finding people defining a microgrid, talking about its responsibilities to its customers, talking about the microgrid's responsibilities to the grid. If you could, put yourself into what do you want to see from the regulatory side that would make your projects move forward more easily?
I guess ultimately you want certainty, but I would argue in a new emerging market, I don't think you can provide certainty. And so I think it's, maybe I'd change the word and say sort of adaptability in the realization that, we need to maybe alter how we look at this going forward. I'm actually on the board of a group called the Alliance to Save Energy, and we've been, for the last year, been running an initiative called a Rate Design Initiative, where a number of utilities and OEMs have been working sort of on this issue to put together a perspective of how should the U.S. be looking at this as this change starts occurring. And so we're probably in the midst of the work, and so no definitive answers, but it is an issue that needs to be resolved. If you've not seen it, actually this week in The Economist cover article, it's called Clean Energy's Dirty Secret. And the big issue, right, is the marginal cost of these renewables is approaching zero. And so it's free. And so as it approaches free, more people want to jump onto it. More people want to jump onto it, there's more stranded assets. Well, then you need to charge more for those because people are leaving. But if you charge more people want to leave. And so there's this vicious cycle that's going to have to be addressed in the coming years. But this is what creates new markets.
Yeah. So in the perfect world of a regulated utility, it would be a way to rate base these assets. Okay, so that we can provide services and treat everybody fairly through our current regulatory structure. And that's a challenge right now, as I did refer to earlier. But, we're working towards that, and we have active engagement. We have our regulators at the state level who have actually come out and visited our sites. They said, we want to learn more about this. We don't want to just sit in the state capitol. We want to come out and visit with you, and they've visited us several times over the past year to actually see demonstrations and see operations of this and enter into deep discussion around the technologies at our test site. So, really, really good to see that happening. My own personal opinion is that as we go forward in this space, we're probably going to see some type of a hybrid approach that may be, a marginal add to a customer's bill where we're delivering microgrid type services for a specific customer or group of customers in an area that we can carve out geographically somehow, or at least through metering technology, where we could provide these services. And if there was enough value there and customers were bought into that concept, we could provide them maybe for, a marginal cost of X% above your standard rate. I often think of this myself as if somebody were to approach me and say, Tom, if we could provide you backup energy service through a community energy storage project that combines solar and energy storage that served your neighborhood, and we could give you backup power at your house for $10 more a month for when the grid went away, would you be in? And my answer would be yes. And I don't know if $10 is the right number or not. But, when I look at that and I say, geez, I don't have to own the generator sitting at my house anymore. I don't have to worry about the fuel supply for it. I know the utility's on point for keeping that asset operating, and they're good at it. I'm in for that. But I don't know if that's the right, structure or not. But, we have opportunities now to work through that. We have some existing rate tariffs that enable us to explore that. And as I had mentioned, some of these projects earlier, we're working through that presently.
So I think one thing that that governments across the U.S. are not currently doing is valuing reliability and resilience. So I brought an example for that one. So Swiss Re, they are a reinsurer. So they sell insurance to other insurance companies. They have 196 billion in global assets. They own the Egg in London. It's a building that looks like an egg. If you saw a picture of it, you probably recognize. They said last week, 2 weeks ago, the sheer magnitude of some of the cyber risks is beyond the capacity of the market. So the insurer is saying, we don't even know how to monetize this. We don't know how to turn this into money. They specifically cited Stuxnet, which is some of the cybersecurity issues in Iran. They referenced the Ukraine attack. And they said, right now, policies are capped at $100 million, which is a drop in the bucket for what these types of events might impact. So what they've said is that insurance premiums are going to increase 15% annually for infrastructure cybersecurity. That is a direct correlation that will be passed on to the ratepayers in one way or another, right? Those get reflected in the market. So as a policymaker, while we think about, yes, we want our microgrids to be resilient, there's a potential vulnerability in that, the opportunity cost of doing nothing is at least 15% annually on the cost of infrastructure insurance. So that's a monetizable benefit that then brings this into my realm, right? Because as a policymaker, when we think about $100 million being a drop in the bucket as a consequence of some sort of cyber attack, that's something that policymakers are not currently, in my argument, offering utility companies, microgrid developers. They're not offering a value stream for that. They're not offering any way to sort of reflect that in markets. And if that's something that's important to us, which obviously insurance companies have said it is, we need to think a little bit better about how we are translating that and enabling our utilities and third-party providers to offer those services.
I think, Kyle makes a really good point about, areas that you don't normally think of, and I think Tom referenced as well, things that you don't normally think of that are part of the value stack. But I'd say, in answer to your question, we're even, a little more basic than that. Even valuing the stuff that's straightforward and in front of us, the energy, the capacity, the ability to unload a transformer, the ability to unload a distribution line, the ability to provide capacity in the bulk market. Those things are not, they're either not defined or not well-defined or, really, really challenging. And when you think about, what's it going to take to get a project done, as you layer on the complexity of resolving these policy issues and working with state regulators, working with the utilities, working with the wholesale markets, working with all the other stakeholders, it just starts to snowball and say, for the investment and the return I'm looking for here, that's a lot of work. And so it's that upfront stuff. So I'd say in terms of what we're looking for, microgrids, or the way I think of it is beyond a campus when you're really talking about rights of way and so forth, all the franchise issues are in play, and that's a huge barrier. And then whether it's on a campus or or maintaining the closed nature of the DERs anyway, and not thinking so much about transferring from facilities and islanding, you still have these basic questions of, can you easily and efficiently monetize the value to the local grid and participate in the larger grid? And without that, you really are back to the customer and saying, how much do you value the reliability or the certainty that I can give you, because I can't really do anything else outside. And so being able to access that stuff efficiently is going to be key.
Okay, so we have a task here for our regulators, but how about for you? What questions do you have for our panelists?
Hi, Ed Yildhall, student, George Washington University. You mentioned reliability a little bit, and also the first panel mentioned reliability in terms of the reliability contracts. Resiliency seems to be well documented that microgrids can provide that resiliency. Is there the same case for reliability in microgrids?
I'll give you a firsthand wake-up call that I had on that topic, and I think it's a great one that you bring up, because I've been thinking about it. As we built out the McAlpine Creek Substation Project, Fire Station 24 for the city of Charlotte, as I said, that was a proof of concept to see whether or not we could use energy storage and solar to provide a backup service for a customer to literally make no changes on their side of the meter. So deliver this service through their existing three-phase service that comes into the fire station. And from a technology perspective, check the box, it was a success. I presented to the IEEE conference, not conference, but the chapter in Raleigh, North Carolina at NC State University. And one of the folks in the room was a statistician and said, you know, Tom, you've increased the resiliency at the fire station, but you've decreased the reliability. I'd like to show you why. And as I thought through that, I started thinking about it, and here was a customer that is literally located a couple of 100 feet from the substation. So in terms of a distribution service, probably doesn't get any better than that in terms of reliability. So I get that. But when I started thinking through the number of pieces of equipment that we had to add to build the microgrid, controllers, battery, solar, reclosers, switches, inverters, et cetera, and how many points of failure we had in that microgrid, I didn't need to do the math. I agreed with them. So I think that that's one of the things that we need to work through, and reliability is different than resiliency, and I think we need to understand that when we look at these microgrids going forward.
I think Lee had a question.
Yeah, I have this is Lee Paddock from George Washington University. I have a lot of military students every year, and many of them write about energy because energy seems to continue to be a big priority, especially islanding and cybersecurity threats and being able to be operational if the grid goes down. I'm wondering what the experience of some of the folks on the panel has been in terms of military installations, the level of interest, the kind of grids that they're thinking about, those kinds of issues.
Sure, and I briefly worked with the staff, a large group of contractors as well as feds at the Office of Energy Initiatives with the Army. They are looking at a variety of different projects, but as I mentioned before, they're also looking at the concept of stackable benefits, right? So what they're looking at is how can we build microgrids, but how can we also build resilient energy systems that are microgrid ready? Right, so if you look at the OEI website, the Army Office's website, they have a map on there that shows all the different projects that they have developed and whether or not they have generation, the controls, and islanding capability. They have little icons because it's so important to them to see this as sort of an incremental process as they develop these projects, because they have to sort of deal with some interesting legal requirements, right? The Army doesn't sell energy. They're not an energy supplier. So how do you develop a project on energy on their land that you can leverage stackable benefits for? Well, what you do is you lease that out to a third party. You lease that area out to a third party. You install your generation. You make sure that you either hook it up with the correct controls or the capability of islanding, or you design it in a way that will be helpful, right? So if you have SRECs, if you have solar renewable energy credits that are valuable, if you have other RECs or other financial incentives that you can leverage, they want to sell that back to the grid. So the strategy that they have traditionally employed is lease the land out. As a part of that lease, have some sort of transaction regarding the energy services that they would offer at a per kilowatt hour rate. So I think that's a really interesting way to approach some of these challenges and restrictions that they have. And they've had varying levels of success, as I think everyone at this table has had. But you can tell that they're learning a lot, and they're doubling down on the concept of distributed generation. So regardless of who's in the in the president's seat in the Oval Office, there is an inherent value to certain organizations within the federal government and outside that the market is going to reflect, regardless of what your priority for generation